You've probably heard of the stereotype of Indigenous people getting everything for free, like free housing, free education, and tax-free. I used to think that too because of ignorance, immaturity, and privilege. My exposure to my previous BC First Peoples class allowed me to start digging into it. The truth is, those claims are misleading. They disregard history, law, and experiences of the First Nations people across Canada. This documentary explores the facts behind these stereotypes, the treaties and policies that are misunderstood, and the result of letting these stereotypes continue. Because when we don't challenge these beliefs, we are both spreading misinformation and helping to do harm to real First Nations people. To understand where the free ride stereotype originates from, we must analyze the foundation of this country. When treaties were signed between First Nations and the Crown, they weren't about handouts, but these were agreements. In exchange for sharing land and resources, First Nations peoples were promised essentials like healthcare, housing, and education, which I should emphasize were treaty obligations, not acts of charity. However, over time, these promises shifted and changed because of colonials. The Indian Act of 1876 gave Canada control over First Nations lives, creating the reserve systems, imposed Indian agents, and enforced restrictions that wanted to erase First Nations identity altogether. Education was used for forced assimilation through residential schools. Housing and infrastructures were underfunded, and land given were resource drained. A 2% federal cap on essential services lasted over 2 decades, ignoring First Nations needs, which continued to grow as time passed. The public, unaware of treaty obligations or the realities of the reserve, began to reduce it all into the stereotype that Indigenous people get everything for free. Let's break down the facts. The idea that First Nations people don't pay taxes is widespread and not true. Only status Indians who earn income on reserve are free from income tax. This exemption is shown in Section 87 and 90 of the Indian Act. Originally, the use was to protect property on reserves, not to offer a financial advantage. Statistics show that over 75% of First Nations live off these reserves and pay income tax, sales, and property taxes, just like everybody else in Canada. Sales tax exemptions also apply in very specific situations. For example, goods and services paid for on reserve or delivered may be tax-free. Furthermore, proper documentation, such as a certificate of Indian status, which First Nations need to apply to, are needed for these exemptions. For example, in Ontario, status Indians and band councils must provide purchase exemptions certificates when buying exempt goods. It's important to note that Métis, Inuit, and non-status First Nations people do not qualify for these exemptions and pay the same taxes as other Canadians. And even for those who do qualify, less than 1% of the total Canadian population actually receive any exemptions at all. Also, when income levels are considered, many First Nations people earn income on reserves are below the federal taxable threshold because of the lack of jobs, isolation, and discrimination. It's key to note that in a historical context, these limited exemptions were never intended to be advantages, but purely part of the trade-off for land and citizenship rights that were never fully honored. It's a misunderstood concept that housing on reserves is free. First Nations communities often access housing via federal programs managed by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. These programs are like those offered to low-income, non-Indigenous Canadians, but with stricter limitations. Sometimes the Band Council borrows money through loans to build homes. These homes are then rented to community members. The mortgages must be repaid, and the cost of maintenance and infrastructure and utilities usually exceeds what federal support can cover. Additionally, individuals usually don't own the land under their homes, so unfortunately, Under the Indian Act, private property ownership is very limited on reserves, meaning you can't build equity or offer land as collateral for a loan, making it incredibly difficult to secure loans for repairs, businesses, or construction. This housing shortage is harsh, as the estimated housing shortage on reserve ranges between 35,000 and 85,000 units across Canada. Around 37% of previously built homes need major repairs, and overcrowding is a serious issue due to limited building space and a growing population. Take the case of Atawawaski First Nations, which declared a state of emergency in 2011. First Nations families lived in uninsulated sheds without running water or proper sanitation, conditions that shocked the country. Education is also misunderstood. While there is some support for post-secondary education under programs like the Post-Secondary Student Support Program, PSSSP, it is not guaranteed, and not all First Nations people qualify. Funding is limited, capped, and lots of eligible students are waitlisted or denied. In similar prior circumstances, Inuit, Métis, and non-status First Nation students are excluded. In this case, it's these federal programs. Even for status Indians, underfunding leads to obstacles that lots of Canadian youth do not face. So, where does the myth come from? It comes from the lack of education about colonial history, systemic underfunding, and the true meaning of treaty obligations. When people see limited, specific benefits, they often interpret them as unfair privileges, without understanding the history, debts, and legal responsibility that continues to weigh down on them. This stereotype carries both short and long-term consequences, affecting First Nations people by reinforcing resentment and casual racism socially. Many First Nations people report being judged or mistreated because of this false assumption that they receive free handouts, affecting hiring decisions, access to services, and even how people are treated in hospitals or classrooms. Long-term impacts run even deeper. Economically, the stereotype blinds Canadians to the unfair systems or rules in society. First Nations communities experience poverty at more than double the national rate. In some regions, the child poverty exceeds 60%. Most income for First Nations people is significantly lower than that of a non-Indigenous Canadian. And unemployment rates remain higher, especially on reserves. Meanwhile, more than 100 First Nations communities still lack access to clean drinking water. Many rely on fly-in access for food, healthcare, and basic supplies because reserves being isolated. In these conditions, even a tax exemption on some goods doesn't come to being enough. When people believe First Nations communities are getting a quote-unquote free ride, they're less likely to support the programs or policies needed to close those gaps. They're more likely to vote against funding or services because they think it's unfair or undeserved. And that's one of the most damaging effects of the stereotype. It stops change from happening. Before making this documentary, I'll admit that I believed this stereotype once too. I thought maybe First Nations people really did get things like free education or housing. But once I became educated and started researching, I realized how wrong that was. What is often described as quote-unquote free comes from treaty agreements and legal obligations. And in many cases, these services are limited, delayed, or underfunded. I've learned how harmful stereotypes like these can be, as they erase the ongoing impacts of colonization and disregard the real challenges First Nations people face.